story of Hosea and Gomer is a fascinating tale found in the Old Testament. And the entirety of the story is pretty much summed up in 3 concise chapters in the book of Hosea. And it's anything but a short and sweet story. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's a story of drama and deception, a story of cheating and then compassion, a story of heartbreak, and then eventually hope. Essentially, here's how the story goes. And this is directly from the book of Hosea, chapter 1, verse 2. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go, take to yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord." I mean, what a way to start a conversation. And can you imagine? "Hi, Hosea. Yeah, it's me, God. I got some good news and some bad news. First, the good news. I'd like you to get married. And the bad news, I'd like you to marry a prostitute." Can you imagine? And this is the amazing thing. Hosea did what God asked of him. And he found Gomer, who was in fact a prostitute, and he married her. And they had 3 children together. And each child was given a specific name by God, and each of the names served as a symbol of some aspect of Israel's relationship with God. The first child was a son named Jezreel. And Jezreel was actually a city which was located in the heart of Israel. And it was in Jezreel that much of the evil associated with Israel's history originated. The word Jezreel actually means that God scatters. And this child was a reminder of God's anger over Israel's wicked ways, and it was a sober picture of the vengeance of God. The second child, who was a daughter, was given a name that meant to have no pity or no mercy. And this name was a symbol and a picture of the unending idol worship that Israel continued to commit. God named this child No Mercy because his mercy and grace continued to be abused by the Israelites. And then a third child, a son, was given a name that meant not mine or nobody. And this name actually seems to have significance both to Hosea's marriage and to Israel's relationship to God. And we don't know exactly the circumstances of how the truth about this child was discovered, but it appears that somehow Hosea came to the realization that this child was not his. And we can well imagine how devastated Hosea felt. And this, of course, also has some pretty prophetic symbolism in that just as Gomer birthed a child from another man, so Israel continued to raise its children to worship idols instead of the one true God. And this name is a picture of God wanting at times to disown Israel. So you have Hosea, who marries a prostitute, and they have 3 very specifically named children. Gomer, who is now a mother of 3, continues in her blatant deception, and she sleeps around, and the marriage ends up falling apart. She abandons her husband and her family, and she eventually leaves home. She goes from man to man, and Gomer somehow finds out that she has no money left. And amazingly, he finds a way to get her food and resources so that she'll stay alive. Well, eventually one of Gomer's lovers sells her into slavery. And Gomer realizes the stark and cold reality that a life of chasing down selfish and deceptive desires, it ultimately led her to despair. So Gomer, who's now enslaved by one of her lovers, and Hosea does the unthinkable. He goes and purchases his wife back. His wife that deceived him and cheated on him and betrayed him and their family. And he pays for her life. And he tells her that he never stopped loving her, and she's welcome to come home. In fact, in Hosea 2, verse 14 through 15, it says this, "Therefore, I'm now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards and will make the valley of Acre a door of hope. There she will sing as in the days of her youth and in the days that she came up out of Egypt. Sometimes I love to read it in the Message version, and it says this, "And now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start all over again. And I'm taking her back out into the wilderness where we had our first date. And I'll court her. I'll give her bouquets of roses. I'll turn Heartbreak Valley into acres of hope." It's an unbelievable love story.
My husband and I were starting to pull away from each other. I don't know, I just thought he was very bullheaded, and I thought, well, I'll just be stubborn like you and I won't talk to you either. So we went on like that, and we would be holding back and not talking to each other. And when we did talk, we would be arguing. I was the most miserable, and everybody was miserable with me. I know my kids were like, they wouldn't even talk to me anymore. And I realized that I always had to have control of everything. I started getting sick in 2004. I didn't feel well, so I went to a specialist, and I was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. You read it, and it's like, oh, yeah, this is a big one. My husband was with me at the doctor's office that time. We both just looked at each other, and it's like we could tell we weren't really living the way we should have been living. And all our arguing is just like all of a sudden stopped. And we leaned on God at that time. I was in the hospital for 40 days. And my husband, who I thought didn't love me at the time, he stood by my side the whole time. He'd barely go home. Well, I lost all my control. It was something I couldn't fix. Nobody's going to be able to fix this but God. And in the process, God fixed a lot of other things. I could feel the love from all my family. I can see that through this all, God is my strength. He's my only strength. I had, 2 years of treatments now. It's like the doctors are just treating these numbers, and I'm just like to the point where God is going to be my healer, and I'm giving it to Him. And I will be healed.
You know, most of us would look at a story like this, and if there's any character identification that happens, it would most likely be with Hosea. I mean, maybe not to the same extent, but I'm sure each of us has experienced someone making a promise and then breaking it, someone asking for our trust and then betraying it. And very, very few of us at first pass would find any identification with Gomer. I don't know many people that compare their life to that of a prostitute. I mean, our natural human instinct is to look at the sins of others before looking at our own. And if I'm honest, that's what I do. I usually look at the offense of another before looking at my own flaws. It's much easier to look at someone else's mess-ups and little blemishes instead of looking in the mirror. I mean, if I look at someone else's life and I can ever so slightly feel better about my circumstances, or if I look at their mistakes and they seem more obtruse and overt than mine, well, then I subtly let myself off the hook. I can live with this prosthetic cover-up that in no way is real, but to everyone else looks like I have my act together. And I think as women, we are superb at this. We cover up and we compare. and we are champions at it. I mean, I just did it the other day. We just moved into a new neighborhood, and so we've been trying to meet our neighbors. And I found out that we have a neighbor right around the corner with 2 kids very close in age to ours. And so I took my children over to meet them, and we talked and walked around the block. And while on the walk, my 4-year-old was in one of his moods. And he had absolutely no interest in sharing the toys that he had brought along. And he was acting selfish and was then resistant, of course, to any discipline. And I found myself trying to work extra hard to make him share, to make him act like a perfect little angel. I wanted us to look like we were this faultless family that had just moved into the neighborhood and we had everything put together. And honestly, I was sort of hoping that the mom would make some sort of major mommy blunder, that, she wouldn't hold her toddler's hand while crossing the street, or she'd fly off the handle when her 3-year-old tried eating the grass as an afternoon snack. But she didn't. She was calm and consistent, tender and loving, and it made me feel terrible. I didn't want the truth to come out that we were all a bit tired and somewhat out of sorts from the move, that we were missing our home and life that we had just left, that we were needy and desperate to find some new friends, that many days I actually am impatient and inconsistent, and I just wanted to look perfectly put together. And what I couldn't believe is that I wanted her to slip up as a mom in the hopes that I would camouflage my own weaknesses as a parent. And I'm pretty sure that this isn't just an issue that moms struggle with. I think it's an issue that women struggle with. We don't ever want our flaws to be found out. We want to keep them hidden. We don't want other women to know that we're insecure, or we don't want other women to know that we appear to have our act together, but really we don't. We want our relationships to be perfect. We want life to always have order and consistency. We want to know the plan, and if we don't, we at least want to act like we do. And in these ways and so many others, that's what actually makes us more like Gomer in this story. You see, the story of Hosea and Gomer is not really a story of Hosea and Gomer. It's the story of God and Israel. And ultimately, it's the story of God and each of us. And each of us in the story is actually Gomer. In some ways, we're her children as well. It's the story of how we're hopeless outside of God. How we sometimes subtly and sometimes overtly betray who God created us to be. How we sabotage others and ourselves. How we neglect God in the way that we know He longs for us to live. How we try to take control of our life instead of trusting God with our life. How we do what we need to make sure that our desires are met instead of waiting on God to actually meet our needs. And these may not seem as intense or overt as a life of prostitution and abandoning a spouse and children, but every time we stray away from our relationship with God and who He created us to be, in many ways, it's the same picture of how Gomer strayed away from Hosea and how Israel continues to stray away from God. The love affair between God and Israel was a painful one. Israel belonged to God. He chose them. And somewhere along the way, they gave their hearts over to another love. But God patiently pleaded with them, but they wouldn't listen. And finally, God had to expose them and the choices that they made. And eventually, there was redemption, but it was really painful. And the story of Hosea and Gomer, it mirrors the same thing. So you can see why God chose to use the names of Hosea and Gomer's children as a symbol of how He felt towards Israel. To name a child No Mercy, or to give them the name Nobody, is pretty telling to the heart of God as to how much it pained Him to watch Israel neglect and betray their relationship with Him. I know that when my husband and I were preparing to have our kids, we had all sorts of conversations about what we would name each of them. And we had our list of boys' names and our list of girl names. And never did we think about a name like Nobody or No Mercy. I mean, a name it's so personal and it's important. And it's uttered thousands of times in a child's life. In fact, for us, we knew how important our kids' names were, that we have a frame hanging in each of their rooms with a picture and the reason for why we gave them their name. We wanted their names to be special and to mean something to them. So after all that God had been through with Israel, and after all that Hosea had been through with Gomer, it's pretty stunning. After Hosea brings Gomer back home, it says in Hosea 2, verse 23, I will show you my love. To the one I called, not my loved one, I will say to those called, not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. I mean, God even brought redemption to Hosea and Gomer's children. He changed their names. And that's why I love this story and the hope that it offers, even in the midst of such heartbreak. God never, ever, ever stops loving us. He can't. He never stops pursuing us. He never stops wanting a relationship with us. And this is good news. Because many of us, we're much like Gomer. I know I can be. I can stray so quickly. I can lose focus. I can worry. I can wonder if God will come through. I can put my hope in a circumstance instead of in God. Maybe you've done the same thing. I mean, maybe it seemed that you took your eyes off of Him for only a moment. But then that moment turned into an hour. An hour into days, and now it's weeks and months and perhaps even years. And you used to hear His voice calling you back, but now all you hear is a deafening silence. And it feels like you pray, but there's no answer. You confess your sins, but you feel no release from the burden. And you worry that somehow maybe you've wandered so far away or done something so terribly wrong that you can never get home again. And no matter what you might have done, no matter how long it's been since you walked away from God, no matter how far you may have wandered from His presence, no matter what you may have said to Him in your anger, frustration, or disappointment, the truth is that God has never, ever stopped loving you, and He will never give up on you. And Gomer had to be willing to come back home. She had to look in the mirror, and she had to see that she had wandered far from Hosea, that she had caused pain. But in some ways, she could not be the one to fix all the pain. Only God could do that. So I'm sure you have probably never spent time thinking that you are anything like a prostitute. But maybe that might be the very best thing you can do, because it might help you see that you need to come back home, because it's never too late with God.